Good morning and welcome to the Friday Morning Break Show with me, Carl Smith, on Teachers Talk Radio.
This is Teachers Talk Radio and you are listening live.
The last decade has not been kind to our children. It seems the more we talk about keeping them safe, the more we end up neglecting them. So, is Britain no longer a country for young people? Have we forgotten them? Today I will explore the view that Britain has fallen out of love with the future.
This is Teachers Talk Radio and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads. No distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded program helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit AxiomMaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering math circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order.
This is Teachers Talk Radio and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Sky News covers a story about behaviour at schools in Wales. It says that according to Estyn, the school's inspectorate for Wales, some parents are unsupportive of tackling poor behaviour. But the article goes on to say that the Welsh Government says it is committed to addressing the issue. The article reports that from the 24 secondary and all-age schools Estyn visited during the last year, nearly all of them noted a degree of difficulty in engaging with some parents. The Welsh Government said it was looking to address declining behaviour in schools and colleges. In the Inspectorate's national survey, many staff described a few parents as unsupportive and sometimes undermining staff by excusing poor behaviour. The main issues identified by staff were low-level disruption, defiance and truancy, and poor behaviours outside of lessons, including vaping, use of mobile phones and damage to school property. When presented with concerns about the child's poor behaviour, A few parents displayed aggressive behaviour towards school leaders and staff, the report said. Most school leaders who responded to Estin's national survey said the overall support from the Welsh Government and other agencies in dealing with challenging behaviour was inadequate, and that schools were having to use limited budget to provide their own behavioural support. Estin has recommended an update to national behaviour guidance. The Welsh Government said it welcomed the report and that it would be discussing these points further at a behaviour summit due later in May. Standard reports that the Educational Institute of Scotland Union is to consult members on possible strike action over a dispute regarding class contact time. The union claims the Scottish Government has failed to deliver on its 2022 promise to address teachers' increasing workload, having stated it would reduce maximum class contact time in schools to 21 hours per week. The union claims neither the Scottish Government nor local authorities have made any proposals on tackling this issue. EIS has announced it will open a consultative ballot at its AGM next month. A new project to strengthen collaboration between universities and businesses and others to drive growth and create jobs in the North East of England has received £8.9 million from Research England. The 5-year programme involves Durham, Newcastle, Northumbria, Sunderland and Teesside universities and is intended to grow the North East's capacity and capability to commercialise impactful university research. Professor Karen O'Brien, Vice-Chancellor and Warden of Durham University, said the project will be a game changer. Over the 5 years, the project will deliver in 7 areas, focused on addressing specific opportunities and barriers to expanding the commercialisation of university research across the region. Research England is investing a total of £30 million in 4 regional projects. Full details of the UK Government's announcement of the projects can be found on the .gov.uk website. Finally, the BBC reports that tens of thousands of GCSE students will get their grades in an app on their phones during this summer's results day. The government is trialling the Education Record app, with 95,000 students in Manchester and the West Midlands ahead of the national rollout. Ministers say they hope it will save money for college admissions teams, but school leaders say students and schools will need support to ensure the app works properly. Students involved in the pilot will still be able to go to school to get their paper results the traditional way. In Scotland, pupils have been able to get results online since 2019. Education Minister Stephen Morgan said it was high time exam records were brought into the 21st century. Unions have also welcomed the trial, but noted it was crucial that government gets this absolutely right. More comment and reactions from school staff and pupils can be found on the BBC News website. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Not a great time to be a child, is it? I think it was Whitney Houston who said, "I believe children are the future. Teach them well and let them lead the way." But what if we don't teach them well? Who will lead the way then? This is Generation Z, and they are growing up before our very eyes. But what will they become? What has the last decade or so been like for children growing up in Britain? Many would say that a combination of economic, social, educational, and health-related pressures have put our children firmly on the back foot. And today I will be exploring why. Back in 2010, perhaps we might have expected that our children would not be a priority. A new government had been elected that believed in the power of the market and wanted to roll back the state. State intervention for our children was not on the cards. Instead, the new emphasis would be on personal responsibility. So it was that in 2010, the Department for Children, Schools and Families simply became the Department for Education. The words children and families were taken out because they implied that the state had a role to play in the lives of young people, which suggested a type of social policy that the new government did not believe in. Instead, they argued, state intervention was not only costly, but ineffective. Responsibility for the welfare of children should sit with parents, went the argument, where it rightfully belonged. The state shouldn't be a nanny, and it shouldn't encourage a dependency culture. Anyway, the argument continued, spending on public services had got out of hand, and it was time to rein it in. This was to be the age of austerity. Now, the new government certainly believed that school improvement was important, but they wanted it to be achieved by making schools act more like businesses. A new entrepreneurial spirit was about to be unleashed on the world of education. So out went Every Child Matters and Sure Start centres, and in came mass academization. With a missionary zeal stemming from his partisan fear and contempt for educators as vectors for the kind of liberal and progressive politics he so disliked, the new Secretary of State for Education, Michael Gove, also threw out child trust funds, the Connection Careers Service, the National Literacy Strategy, Building Schools for the Future, and even Teachers TV. This was no time for integrated welfare services with their socialist cradle-to-the-grave overtones, or for over-bloated bureaucracies and armies of government advisors. Instead, a bonfire of programs and policies was the order of the day. Now, the new government knew that this wasn't what teachers wanted, but they were prepared to take them on. Gove labelled the educational establishment a blob that was resistant to change. It was felt to be in the grip of Marxist unions with progressive theories about active learning and developing skills rather than building knowledge. Gove told us that he had had enough of experts, by which we can only assume he meant teachers and school leaders, who he felt had failed a generation by neglecting the 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic. In the words of a former Prime Minister, John Major, it was time to get back to basics. Ministers were particularly concerned that Britain was lower in the international league tables than they would like, the so-called pizza rankings. They felt that schools had been too busy racking up their point scores, teaching pupils low-value qualifications like GCSE baking or media studies, when what young people really needed to know was how to spell and how to use correct grammar. Some said that teachers were guilty of the soft bigotry of low expectations. From now on, schools were to be held to account for dumbing down standards in this way by a new no-nonsense Ofsted, led by a new no-nonsense chief HMI, Michael Wilshaw. Replacing these low-value, so-called vocational courses would be the core academic subjects that had served Gove so well at his own private school in what was now to be called the English Baccalaureate. Schools would be set targets for the number of pupils who were entered for these subjects. And the GCSEs themselves would also be reformed to make them harder and to stretch the most able, with the introduction of a grade 9 as part of a new 1 to 9 scale. Out went most coursework and modular exams, and in came longer, more demanding academic exams. Those that failed English and maths would be made to retake them post-16 until they eventually did pass them. At primary level, a phonics revolution would ensure that every pupil could read confidently and fluently by the time they went to secondary school. Gove, assisted by his henchman Dominic Cummings, was now on a crusade, and the Treasury was right behind them both. Education is rarely a priority for governments of any colour. The gains are too nebulous and long-term. When compared to lowering taxes, investing in education doesn't garner many votes, and elections are never won or lost on education policy. Throw in an educational establishment that tended towards the left, and becoming Secretary of State for Education was generally seen as a bit of a poisoned chalice for any up-and-coming right-leaning politician, best visited briefly on the way to bigger and better things. This is why there were no less than 11 different Secretaries of State for Education in 14 years. One incumbent, Michelle Donnellan, held the post for a mere 35 hours. However, this was not the case with Gove. He was an exception because he occupied the position for 4 long years, considering it possibly the most important part of his legacy. For him, education was a priority, and the blob would just have to get used to it. In those years, the Treasury held the whip hand in policy making, and austerity was the name of the game. So education funding, as a proportion of national income, inevitably fell from its peak in 2010. Between 2010 and 2019, school spending per head in England fell by approximately 9% in real terms. Nominal spending did increase by 1%, but since there was an 11% increase in pupil numbers, the amount spent per pupil plummeted. Things recovered a little in 2019, but by 2024, per pupil funding was still 3% below its 2010 level in real terms. Depressingly, schools in disadvantaged areas faced the most severe cuts, with a 12% reduction in funding between 2010 and 2021. Never fear, the pupil premium was here. Nick Clegg, the leader of the Liberal Democrats long before he became President of Global Affairs at Facebook, aimed to do something about the attainment gap between disadvantaged pupils, as they became known, and their more advantaged peers. His idea was to ring-fence funding for disadvantaged pupils so that schools with more disadvantaged pupils got more money. In return, all schools would be held to account for closing the attainment gap between disadvantaged pupils and their more advantaged peers. Ofsted would inspect whether schools were achieving this and therefore using the money properly. With all this extra money, it was argued, schools that did not close the gap were simply letting their most disadvantaged pupils down, and that was unacceptable. Schools had dedicated funding for disadvantaged pupils, and they were expected to close the gap accordingly. It was a fine and noble aim. Gove himself was outspoken in his desire to level the playing field, and even on one famous occasion railed against the privileges of private schools as well. It all sounded like a genuine attempt to help the poorest children in school. What could possibly go wrong? Well, for a start, the pupil premium wasn't an additional payment at all. It actually simply replaced core funding. And without core funding, schools can't help anyone. Unsurprisingly, labelling part of the drop in overall funding as a pupil premium was not going to work. Staffing makes up about 80% of a school's costs. So when funding drops, staffing also drops, and therefore class sizes rise. Also, pay for teachers in real terms steadily declined in these years. And naturally, when the pay drops, fewer people wanted to do the job. Consequently, the recruitment pool for teachers shrank, and with it, the quality of the workforce. Furthermore, the idea itself was based on a false premise. Schools themselves can do little, relatively speaking, to reduce the inequality that stems from household income and social class. Critics may argue that this just lets them off the hook, allowing them to make excuses for low achievement by putting it all down to social class. But the simple truth is that having poor parents has a much bigger impact on a child's life than school can ever do. Nevertheless, when they pointed this out, teachers were accused of having low expectations, particularly in areas where large numbers of children claimed free school meals. However, the teachers were right. Over the last 20 years, there's been virtually no reduction in the gap between children on free school meals and their more fortunate peers, even though plenty of schools were failed by Ofsted for not closing that gap. Schools were both a substitute and a scapegoat for wider failings. As the sociologist John Goldthorpe puts it, you can only reduce inequality by providing substantial financial support to those who need it, either through welfare benefits or by intervening in the labour market. No government on earth can eradicate disadvantage and inequality by ring-fencing a dwindling budget and calling it a pupil premium. It wasn't a top-up, it was just plugging a gap in core funding. Unsurprisingly, therefore, the pupil premium has failed in its sole objective, to narrow the gap in attainment between the disadvantaged and everyone else. Meanwhile, child poverty has soared. There are now approximately 4.5 million children living in poverty in the UK. That's 31% of all children. In the 11 years up to 2023, the number of children in poverty rose by 800,000. The story of the 20th century had been one of falling child poverty, but that story ended in 2010 and it has been rising ever since, with a brief blip when universal credit temporarily rose during the pandemic. The West Midlands suffers most, with 36% of its children living in poverty, followed closely by the North West and London on 35%, Yorkshire and Humber on 32%, the North East on 31%, and the East Midlands on 29%. Only children in the South West and South East enjoy the same or lower poverty levels than they did in 2012. There is far more child poverty than in 2010, and that is not good news if you are a child. These children could take comfort in two gifts given to them by the state. The first came in the form of a free copy of the King James Bible sent to every school, no doubt read avidly by young people everywhere. The second was a free oak-framed portrait of King Charles, presumably to be displayed alongside it. Now, there is nothing wrong with reproductions of important historical records or portraits of the monarch. After all, pride in our country's history and its traditions is no bad thing. But it was a gift to those who said that the government had its priorities in the wrong place. The curriculum was also changing, with Gove decreeing that Byron, Keats, Jane Austen, Dickens, and Thomas Hardy were back on the reading list. A tougher core of science and maths and a modern foreign language was to be studied by as many pupils as possible, and history would focus more on our island story. However, a focus on the basics needs more suitably qualified teachers to teach them, and they were in increasingly short supply, particularly in science and maths. Oddly, market rules did not apply to teacher pay, as teachers continued to be paid what the state decided rather than be determined by the forces of supply and demand. Normally, if a highly sought after skill is in short supply, the people with these skills are paid more. But in the case of education, that didn't seem to happen. The market didn't decide their wage, the state did. Free schools were another new initiative. They were ironically named because they were anything but free. In fact, they were substantially more expensive to set up than maintain schools. The idea was to allow communities to set up their own schools rather than those schools that the state provided for them. No evidence was gathered, no models were set out, and no trials were run. Self-appointed groups of parents, some with a religious commitment, were given money from a ring-fenced education budget to set up these free schools, and councils were given no say in the matter. Naturally, activist parents were more likely to live in areas where schools were already doing well. So free schools often replaced existing good schools, but at a greater cost to the taxpayer. By 2023, 650 free schools had been created. There is very little evidence that they work, at least on a system level. Some are better than others, just like some schools of all types are better than others. In terms of results, however, free primaries tend to perform worse than mainstream primaries, although free secondaries do a little better. The reason, as the Education Policy Institute has explained, is that the best performers disproportionately draw their pupils from neighbourhoods that already achieve high results on average. In some areas, free schools were little more than grammar schools, through the back door. After Gove left, free schools received less attention because they were his pet personal project. Other politicians were less interested. No one has produced a cost-benefit analysis to check on the value to the taxpayer of this considerable diversion of public resources. Another strand of this brave new world of education was trusting in trusts. Labour had introduced Academy Trust in the early 2000s, but this was one idea the new government did not throw out. Quite the reverse. Gove decreed that he would like all schools to be liberated from the clutches of local authorities and, where possible, bundled together into multi-academy trusts or MATs, which would act like mini local authorities, but without the public accountability. The idea was that the best schools would spread their expertise to other schools in the trust, using the power of the market to divert resources to the right places. As we speak, 4/5 of England's secondary schools are now part of a MAT. It has been a huge experiment in school reorganisation, and only now are we able to take a long-term view of whether it has been a success. Not all schools bought into this new vision, so to give them a little nudge, Gove decided that schools that failed their Ofsted would be compelled to join a MAT, providing there was one that wanted to have them, which wasn't always the case. This added an extra element of jeopardy for school leaders to keep them on their toes. Not only would they face the opprobrium of the public for failing their inspection, but they would also face the prospect of having new masters to whom they would have to pay a 5% fee for the privilege. A new cadre of well-paid CEOs have been appointed to lead MATs, adopting a business-like title for a more business-like approach to education. Ofsted has found, though, that schools in MATs do not get better results. This is likely to cause something of a rethink. Nevertheless, by 2022, the direction of travel had gathered such momentum that most schools were either joining MATs or being compelled to do so. In fact, the proportion of pupils in primary academies that reach the expected standard in reading, writing and maths is slightly below that of local authority schools, despite the higher costs of running MATs. MATs would argue this is because they have taken on some challenging schools, although there are plenty of stuck schools that MATs have not taken on. This is not to say that there have not been some very good MATs, just like there are some very good maintained schools. But being in a MAT does not seem, in and of itself, to be a golden ticket to success, nor offer the taxpayer better value for money than maintained schools under local authority control. What is striking is the relative lack of evidence either way. The truth is that this giant experiment in educational reorganisation has achieved pallid results, at best. Given that resources in education are precious, alternatives are now being considered. But the trust system has become so imbued in the education sector that it will be difficult to untangle it for many years to come. Now we're going to go for a word from our sponsors, and then we'll rejoin the story about the decade that forgot children.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads. No distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded programme helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering maths circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order.
Let's move on to COVID. COVID came out of nowhere in 2020, and it afflicted children profoundly, even if the virus itself mostly targeted older generations. Something about the pandemic arrested the development of children, and this manifested itself in all sorts of ways. By 2023, more than 80,000 children born in the years 2020 and 2021 had not reached the key measures of personal progress for their age group. It also heralded an attendance crisis. In 2022 to 23, more than 1 in 6 primary and 1 in 4 secondary pupils were persistently absent from school. That is, they missed more than 10% of the entire year. In surveys, up to a quarter of parents no longer thought that it was even essential for their child to go to school every day, commonly citing poor mental health as the reason. This was a profound change of attitude, with some suggesting the social contract between parents and schools had somehow become broken. To be clear, the pandemic affected children worldwide, and in the thick of the crisis, no one understood precisely what long-term effect it would have on them. However, as the pandemic waned, the race was on to recover the situation, and in this respect, the government did not prove equal to the task. Schools received some money for catch-up tutoring, but it was delivered by agencies that most schools found to be ill-equipped for the task. Nevertheless, the need was there. In 2022, no fewer than 2 million children were found to be behind their peers in talking and understanding words, higher than ever previously recorded. And the existing body of speech and language therapists have been unable to meet the demand. Sir Kevin Collins, a distinguished former teacher, was appointed to lead the recovery plan. But when he asked for the funding he needed, he was told in no uncertain terms that it wasn't there. The funding that was made available was 15 times less than Collins felt was required, amounting to just £22 per child in primary schools. So he promptly resigned. The Education Policy Institute found the country was well behind its target to get 9 out of 10 pupils to the expected standard in reading, writing and maths. But apparently, there was no money to do anything about it. It is true that the OECD has found no clear link between results and the amount spent on schooling, exemplified by the success of such countries as Singapore and South Korea. The 2022 OECD rankings offered light and shade in this respect. On the one hand, UK children achieved their lowest scores in mathematics and science since 2006, and their reading results were also down. But on the other hand, the scores in many countries had declined even further. For example, while UK maths results had slumped by 13 points since 2006, the average across all OECD countries had fallen by 16 points. This actually had the effect of pushing UK children up the PISA rankings, although it was hardly a cause for celebration. However, it does put things into perspective. There were marked differences in the rankings between the four nations of the UK, with England coming top, rising from 17th in the 2018 rankings for maths to an honourable 11th in 2022. Oddly, given the lack of social progress in the UK in recent times, the OECD did note that socioeconomic status was weaker in predicting performance in mathematics here than in most countries elsewhere. Weighed against this, a third of all English pupils failed to get a pass in English and maths, including half of those claiming free school meals. Only a fifth of those who failed maths the first time would ever pass, no matter how many times they retook it post-16. Unsurprisingly, it seems that the quality of teaching is still the decisive factor in determining school improvement. But as we've established, fewer people have wanted to become teachers. In real terms, salaries were 10% lower than they had been in 2010, and only half the number of teachers needed were recruited in 2023, despite the offer of bursaries in some subjects. Recruitment for physics was an astonishing 83% below the government's own target. So much for the future of UK science, technology, and productivity. The blob was quitting the profession in large numbers. Sadly, young people did not seem happy with their lot. The OECD has found a quarter of UK students are dissatisfied with their lives, more than in most other countries, and this is really worrying. The slow death of the arts in schools does not help, with GCSE and A-level arts entries down by a half. Fewer children were singing in choirs, playing in orchestras, or acting in school productions, which seems odd for a country famous for the success of its creative industries. And it's not as though they were playing sport either, because PE hours were being cut and playing fields were being sold off. The joy was being sucked out of life in school. The world was also becoming an angrier place, and young people were angrier than most. Since the pandemic, schools have reported significantly higher levels of student anxiety, disengagement, and disruptive behaviour. Suspensions have rocketed as a result, with disadvantaged children and those with special educational needs most likely to be suspended. The response to this crisis has been polarising, with some schools implementing strict zero-tolerance policies to keep order and establish boundaries. In May 2023, 76% of teachers reported that misbehaviour stopped or interrupted their teaching in at least some of their lessons in the past week. This compared to 64% the year before. 58% of teachers said that up to 10 minutes were lost due to poor behaviour out of every 30 minutes they taught, while 73% said bad behaviour was having a negative effect on their mental and physical health. Evidence strongly suggests poor behaviour is one of the main reasons why teachers leave the profession. Parents were up in arms, so a tsunami of complaints overwhelmed schools, particularly school leaders, who had to cope with a sharp rise in abuse, both in person and online. Social media became a cesspit of school leader bashing, to the point where many decided the job was simply not worth it anymore. According to the law firm Brown Jacobson, 2/3 of school leaders in 2023 said parental complaints had risen in the past year, and a staggering 90% said that this was having a detrimental effect on their well-being. This was before they faced the wrath of their governors, trust boards, Ofsted, and local authorities, who were usually called upon by parents when they did not get the answers that they wanted. No doubt a good deal of this was because they did not know what to do with their children and felt in despair, but it did nothing for morale in schools. Schools were accessible to them, and it was easier for them to blame schools than to take responsibility themselves. In this brave new world, it was supposed to be parents who took greater responsibility for their children's welfare and behaviour, but the reverse seemed to be the case. When the Ofsted call came, schools feared parental surveys would stack up against them, and inspectors would often take their side. It was a toxic atmosphere, and children were not better for it. The truth was that schools were being inspected to death. The tragic death of primary head teacher Ruth Perry saw an outpouring of anger against a regime of terror, target and inspection that tightened the screws on schools and made school leaders feel that they were being set up to fail. Ruth Perry killed herself after inspectors judged her previously outstanding school as inadequate. It did not seem to matter to them that she had spent her professional life helping young people, or that as she did so, public services were crumbling all around her. She was made to feel that she, and she alone, was responsible, and it was a feeling she could not bear. The inspectors did not comment on her dwindling budgets. She had touched the hearts of thousands of young people in her community, but all that counted for nothing in this brutal verdict. Coroners tend to avoid giving definitive causes for suicide, but a harsh Ofsted judgment was named as a key contributor to the death of a woman without any previous signs of depression. The inspection had lacked fairness, respect, and sensitivity, and it was rude and intimidating. The chief HMI, Amanda Spielman, appeared defensive and reluctant to accept responsibility. Similar stories flooded in, tales of unjust and bullying inspections where one fault, often administrative, condemned an otherwise good school to oblivion. No wonder a third of new head teachers quit after 5 years. One Secretary of State, Gillian Keegan, even said that she would punch a rude inspector herself. Quite what led us to the point where it was deemed acceptable to treat dedicated head teachers in this way is still a matter of debate, but it is difficult to see how it benefited children and young people. Ultimately, they suffer the consequences of a broken profession, highly anxious and struggling to recruit and retain its best staff. Talking of crumbling services, the very buildings that children attended were also crumbling too. The Building Schools for the Future programme had been cancelled in 2010, simply to be replaced by Not Building Schools for the Future. Existing schools would somehow have to make do and mend. It was a case of not fixing the roof while the sun shined, sometimes quite literally. This culminated in the headline-grabbing RAAC crisis of 2023, when several schools were forced to temporarily close, having been found to have buildings containing reinforced, autoclaved, aerated concrete that was at risk of collapse. It was being used long after its shelf life, and there was a clear risk of loss of life. Meanwhile, 86% of UK schools contained asbestos. The long-term risks to staff and students are unknown, but it is surely unacceptable that young people are forced to learn in such conditions. Not that there was a surfeit of building workers coming out of the FE colleges. During Brexit, plumbing had enjoyed a brief moment in the spotlight amid complaints of an influx of immigrant workers who were taking away opportunities for British young people to become skilled in a trade. However, once the referendum was over, there was no major investment in vocational education and no new generation of British plumbers, builders and electricians. Instead, would-be trainees were told that without English and Maths GCSE, they were not going to get onto the higher level training courses they wanted to anyway. Imbalance in the national skill set has been worrying politicians for years, and the market was providing no answers. Employers preferred to recruit from abroad rather than invest in the domestic workforce, despite claims of an apprenticeship revolution. For most politicians, this was a problem that affected other people's children, because theirs went to university. FE teachers' pay declined by 18% in a decade, and a quarter of FE teachers leave after just 1 year. This is not the skills revolution young people were promised. Instead, the government's answer was to abolish the existing vocational qualifications in favour of new, more demanding qualifications known as T-levels. The theory was that the existing qualifications were simply not up to the job, even though post-16 teachers and lecturers argued that they served a useful purpose. This is not a new argument. Experienced staff will remember that diplomas introduced at much expense and to almost no effect in the early 2000s. T-levels are designed to cater for students who want an alternative to A-levels, but do not wish to take an apprenticeship, which typically requires 80% of a student's time to be spent with an employer. Unfortunately, many do not complete the course, with only 71% of the 10,000 starting T-levels in 2022 actually finishing them, an astonishing 30% dropout rate. Nearly half of the dropouts ended up leaving education altogether. T-levels are bound to affect a disproportionate number of young people from low-income households who used to follow BTEC and City and Guilds qualifications, which had much lower dropout rates. Ofsted said that T-levels offered poor value and inappropriate work placements. While the jury is still out on the long-term impact of T-levels, so far they have not been an unqualified success. In 2023, the Prime Minister announced a new post-16 qualification should be developed by combining the best of A-levels and T-levels in an advanced British standard. Widely derided as a soundbite, it has now been quietly dropped. Technical qualifications matter to the economy and to young people, but unfortunately the last decade has been a story of overpromising and under-delivering. Recently, it seems many adults have not been very keen on having children at all. The birth rate has plummeted at an alarming rate since 2015. To be clear, this has not been a rebellion by mothers. Society has not suddenly turned against parenthood. On the contrary, women have told pollsters that they were sad to be having fewer babies than they wanted. However, the reality is that child rearing has become increasingly unaffordable. And because many households depend on having 2 full-time working parents to keep their head above water, having more children has become out of the question. Higher rents and mortgages combined with lower real wages and uncertain hours have meant that young families now spend as much as a third of their income on nursery fees. And this just isn't viable. If they do become pregnant, women have found that maternity and obstetrics have become the Cinderella of the NHS, with the number of midwives down by a third and Sure Start centres now only a distant memory. Targets for reducing stillbirths and infant deaths have been missed by a long way, and at the end of 2023, the health regulator reported that 2/3 of maternity units were unsafe. Once born, children are literally growing shorter than before, as the UK has slid down the international height table. Almost 1 in 4 children aged 10 and 11 are also obese, and after a year of lockdown, that rose by a fifth more again. Obesity rates amongst 4 and 5-year-olds were unheard of 30 years ago, but now they have doubled. The proportion of children leaving primary school overweight remains at a high level, storing up a heightened risk of diabetes, cancer, and other serious health problems for later in life. As for 2023-24, approximately 9.6% of children who'd started primary school were classified as obese, an increase from 9.2% the year before. Proposals to extend the sugar tax have been delayed, despite clear evidence that it works, and around 70% of the commitments made in the government's obesity plan have not yet been implemented. It feels very much as though we can and should be doing better. Neither have our children been happier. The 2023 annual report on their well-being from the Children's Society found that average happiness scores for their life as a whole, their friends, their appearance, school and schoolwork were all significantly lower than they had been, with girls lower than boys, although the recent broadcasting of the TV series Adolescence has brought into sharp focus the crisis of confidence being experienced by many young men. Teenage life has always had its ups and downs, but this is on a different scale altogether. The mental health crisis amongst young people has been attributed to many things, including mobile phones, online gaming, social media, exam pressures, and overdiagnosis by doctors. But all of these are more likely to be part of a wider malaise, which both affects how young people see themselves and the world around them. Meanwhile, mental health services have proven to be woefully inadequate, with waiting lists for the Child Mental Health Service CAMHS extending up to a year. There has also been a large increase in the number of children diagnosed with special educational needs in the last 10 years. A major reform of the SEND system took place in 2014, introducing education, care and health plans for those with the most complex needs. It promised great things, but it has been an unmitigated disaster. The reforms doubled the number of eligible children to 230,000, raising parental expectations in the process. This included an explosion in transport costs for local authorities, who were now required to deliver large numbers of young people to specialist facilities, often far from their home. In rural areas, the cost of this has been crippling, but everywhere, financial meltdown has followed. Parents complain about schools not supporting their child's needs, and schools complain they have nowhere near the resources to do so. Meanwhile, local authorities face bankruptcy as they have nothing like the funding they need to deliver what parents believe they are entitled to. Clearly, some honest conversations are required about the support we want and the support we can afford. Either we fund that support or we lower our expectations about what we can provide. For children in the care system, the reality has been even worse. According to the NSPCC, cases of cruelty and neglect doubled in the last 5 years up to 2023. The number taken into care has shot up, with 139,000 children stuck in homeless accommodation and at high risk of harm. At the same time, the number of social workers has fallen, so that the remaining staff have had less time for their burgeoning caseloads, resulting in more children taken from their parents and into care. In 2010, 64,000 children were in the care system, but in 2023 that had risen to 84,000. Some county councils have said that children's services are in a state of carnage. Children were at the mercy of private-run establishments. Cash-strapped councils were placing children far away, hundreds of miles in some cases, in homes in the cheapest, poorest places, such as Blackpool and other depressed coastal towns. According to John Pierce, president of the Association of Directors of Children's Services, homes can pick and choose which referrals to accept, and they can set their price accordingly, because there's such an overwhelming demand, particularly for placements for children with special complex needs. These placements increased tenfold in the 5 years to 2022-23, and it is costing local authorities the earth. The system has become totally unsustainable. For example, Middlesbrough Authority spends 4/5 of its entire budget on adult and child social care. That, together with the spiralling cost of supporting children with SEND, means that many local authorities are on the brink of collapse. Everyone in education agrees that the early years are the most important. Investment in the early years has had the greatest effect, and the older a child is, the harder it is to effect change. Sure Start Centres had been a great success in the early 2000s, well, at least according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Centre for Social Justice, yet they were abandoned after 2010, leaving a huge gap in support for our youngest children. Arriving ill-equipped at school is too late for many, but catching problems early can save children from a lifetime of delinquency, poor physical and mental health, and even poorer job and income prospects. There were 3,500 Sure Start centres created in the early 2000s, providing a wide range of support from speech and language therapy to parenting classes, and they made a big difference. IFS research showed that the benefits lasted all the way up to GCSE, with Sure Start children achieving 3 grades higher than similarly deprived children who had not attended the centres. By 2015, they had all but disappeared, and the children that suffered most were the most disadvantaged. To be fair, parents were now entitled to 30 years of free childcare compared to 15 hours in 2010. Although nurseries are now closing because the funding that they received does not cover the cost of the place. Having free childcare is no use if there's nowhere to attend. It is hardly helped by the fact that there is a shortage of nursery staff, not surprising given that they receive such low pay. Furthermore, when the hours of free childcare were extended to 30 hours, it was only targeted at working families, which meant that many children with parents who were not at work or whose parents had severe mental health and addiction problems did not benefit. Yet it is these very same children who were most in need of free childcare. There are currently still no plans to extend this provision to non-working parents. Finally, we return to our question. Has this been the decade that forgot children? We have found that compared to 2010, children are poorer, less healthier, less happy, more likely to be suspended from school, more likely to be diagnosed with special educational needs, more likely to be in care, less likely to be attending school at all, or when they are attending, less likely to be taught by a qualified teacher or in a building that is fit for purpose, and less likely to be able to read and write. They also have less support from external agencies, and the gap between the most disadvantaged and the rest has widened. On the plus side, they are more likely to qualify for free childcare, and when compared to children in many other countries, their reading and math scores have not deteriorated as much, although they remain well below where they were before. Of course, they are also less likely to have been born at all, simply because many potential parents have decided that they cannot afford to have children in the first place. We are now seeing the children of austerity growing up before our very eyes. The decisions that have been made over the last decade will affect them for the rest of their lives, and it doesn't look good. If Whitney Houston was right, then we may all suffer the consequences. Let's hope that in the next decade, we remember our children again. Thank you for listening to this podcast today. Do listen to other shows on Teachers Talk Radio, and I'll welcome you back to my Friday morning break show in 2 weeks' time.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.